With that, I would like to say for those of us who are joining for the first time, the Montana Human Rights Network, MHRN, is a 501c3, not-for-profit, nonpartisan organization that works to advance human rights throughout Montana. While we are headquartered in what is known as Helena, we have staff in Butte, Bozeman, and the Flathead Valley, and all of those are located on Indigenous land. As such, we would like to make space to acknowledge that we are here to dismantle discrimination and fight against white supremacy, but we are also participants in and products of systems of settler colonialism, systemic racism, economic exploitation, heteronormativity, and other structures that reinforce white supremacy and other forms of oppression. Please be advised tonight that the topic is heavy. We are going to have to tell you a lot of difficult things tonight. This will include examples of anti-LGBTQ bigotry and white supremacy. The content may be very disturbing and triggering to some people, so please take care of yourselves. We will try to give you a heads up when there are slides that are particularly disturbing, but we do need to know that some of this difficult information will be part of our presentation. If you would like to know about other upcoming webinars, action items that we have and so on, we would encourage you to sign up for our action alerts. There's a link that just popped into the chat for you. And I think with that, we are ready to go. Our first presenter tonight. So the presenters tonight are all on the Montana Human Rights Network staff. Sean Rager, Travis McAdam, and myself. And we are going to be starting off with Travis McAdam, probably the foremost expert on white nationalism and extremism in Montana.
Thank you, Sherilyn, and thanks to everybody joining tonight. I see a lot of friends and a lot of longtime MHRN supporters. For those of you that I haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Travis McAdam. I direct our program at MHRN called Combating White Nationalism and Defending Democracy. And I've spent about the last 20 years or so researching, writing about, and helping communities understand and respond to various anti-democratic movements and far-right extremists in the state. So Sherilyn mentioned a content warning, and that is definitely true with this presentation, and I think especially with quite a few of the slides that I'll be sharing. And there really are portions of these slides that are going to include screenshots of racist, anti-Semitic, homophobic, transphobic material that is produced and distributed by right-wing extremists. And we don't take including this kind of material in our presentations lightly, but we do think that sometimes it's necessary to have spaces like this where we can really talk about what these groups think, what they're doing, and how they do it. And so with Sherilyn's warning and just kind of reaffirming that, we'll go to kind of my first real slide of content. So I think that all of us probably recognize that the attacks on the LGBTQ community, and I'll probably just be saying the community because I tend to, for some reason, the Q and community, I kind of fumble over. So I may just say the community, but that the attacks on the community really come from both what most people think of as really right-wing extremists all the way up through more what is considered mainstream conservatism. But I thought that we'd kind of start out on kind of that extreme end with the white nationalist movement. So I think when people think of white nationalism, the first things that come to mind generally tend to be obviously the racism and the anti-Semitism that are very clearly drivers of the white nationalist movement. But I think what people often don't kind of factor in or realize is that a hatred of the LGBTQ community really is part and parcel to white nationalist thought and action. And just as a way of demonstrating that, I put some examples on this slide of material from the past, more social media posts from the present that kind of show how that is this theme that is consistent over time in the white nationalist movement. So on the left is actually a copy of a flyer that a local Klan group used in Billings back in 1993 that was distributed really in response to work that MHRN and allies were doing in the community to push back against the Klan and neo-Nazis who were targeting the local Jewish community at the time. The middle screenshot is from a group that's active right now in Montana, the National Socialist Movement, also called the American Nazi Party. And I think that it gets at how the LGBTQ community is generally talked about in larger terms of the white nationalist movement. So it gets at this idea of this conspiracy that the LGBTQ community is part of this evil plan by these basically global Jewish overlords. They really view the work for equality as something that Jewish people have created and supported over the years, all as part of this grand conspiracy plan to destroy the white race. And then finally on the right is another group that's been active here in Montana over the last couple of years, the White Lives Matter group, the chapter here in Montana. And I included this one again, just to show the type of language and just the blatant, disgusting, homophobic, transphobic rhetoric that these groups use. You can go into any white nationalist website, into any chat room, into any social media spaces, and find this type of language used. And so in this case, this was a person posting in the White Lives Matter group who lives down in the Bitterroot Valley, who was really upset about measures that were being taken to support gay pride during Gay Pride Month here in Montana. And so again, this hatred, it exists out there on what most of us consider the fringes. And again, when it comes to the white nationalist movement, it's really woven into these larger anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that have really proven as the ideological foundation and basis for the white nationalist movement for decades, if not centuries. But we also know that this targeting, this animosity, this dislike, this hatred of the community exists very much in the conservative mainstream. And that isn't just present some of the time, that it seems like it's there all the time. And it is. And I think it's a little bit instructive and a little bit good to understand why that's the case. Now I have like this entire hour-long presentation about this topic. For some reason, my coworkers said that people didn't want to listen to me do that for an hour and then listen to the rest of the material too. So I tried to boil it down into this fairly confusing slide that will hopefully make a little bit of sense as I go through it. So the short answer as to why this is an ever-present issue is that the religious right basically took over the Republican Party back in the 1980s while deploying an inside-outside strategy. So the founders of that movement created a conservative political movement that really fused this idea of religious practice and conservative political activism. And in doing that, the religious right literally held national events where they trained their people on how to become GOP Central Committee members, how to run for office, how to do all of those steps that are necessary to create and build power in a party, in this case, the Republican Party. Now, while they were creating this movement, they understood that, for instance, conservative evangelicals and conservative Catholics don't always agree on theology. And so instead of focusing on theology, they didn't need to do that. They were creating a political movement, not a theological one, a political one. And to those ends, they very smartly decided to prioritize issues. So they came up with issues like stopping abortion, like breaking down church-state separation, like opposing LGBTQ equality, in order to help these various factions of largely conservative Christians be able to come together into this political force. So by taking over central committees, by getting their candidates to run for office, by participating in the party, what they were able to do is they were able to take these culture war issues, including the targeting of the LGBTQ community, and turn it into kind of this evergreen issue for them when it came to things like drafting political platforms, when it came to crafting and introducing policy, when it came to using these issues to get conservative Christians out to vote for their candidates. So all of those measures are happening within the party. So they're basically that kind of purplish arrow in that Republican Party circle on the inside of the party, pushing the party to the right, always trying to get the Republican Party to be more conservative. So is that enough? I mean, to take over a lot of the Republican Party? Well, of course that's not enough. And so you also have the religious right and really Christian nationalists as a whole that have an army of advocacy groups that exist outside the Republican Party. And in doing that, they have this whole network of groups that use those same issues, whether it's LGBTQ equality, whether it's abortion, whether it's these other issues, in order to engage the Republican Party and continually tell the party and its officials that no matter how conservative they get, it's never far enough to the right. So in essence, you have these people on the inside of the party pushing the party to the right. You have these advocacy groups mobilizing people outside the party to pull the party to the right at the same time. What does that mean? That means that issues like opposing equality, like targeting the LGBTQ community, that the underlying homophobia and transphobia around all of those issues have become these continuous mobilizing issues for the right, for the Republican Party. And that's why over time we continue to see this issue always there and always used, because they've been able to create a political movement both on the inside and the outside of the Republican Party that stresses using homophobia and transphobia, both initially to create power in the Republican Party and now to maintain it. And just because homophobia and transphobia are these motivating issues, if you will, over time, doesn't mean it always looks the same. So oftentimes the angle that's used is changed. So Sean will be going into more about quite a bit of this, and so I'm going to try to stay at a really broad level and go through this pretty quickly. But okay, so right now we're seeing a lot of attacks on trans athletes and we're seeing a lot of book challenges. How did we get here? How are we at those issues right now? Well, think back. So early in the 2000s, the transphobia, the homophobia that was being used in the political arena really centered around ending gay marriage. And so you had both at the state and federal levels, these anti-gay marriage amendments proposed. So here in Montana, the Montana Family Foundation passed a constitutional amendment by ballot initiative back in 2004 that banned gay marriage in Montana. Those ballot initiatives, that type of policy work was happening all over the country. Well, then litigation happens. There are challenges filed to these various laws. Some of them start making their way through the court system, and it starts to become pretty apparent that these cases are going to end up at the US Supreme Court. And while it's hard to imagine this in current times, back at that time, it was pretty clear that the US Supreme Court was going to strike down these gay marriage bans. And the religious right, they could see the writing on the wall. They knew that there was a very good chance all of a sudden gay marriage wasn't going to be this amazing issue for them to use anymore. And so they pivoted and they started going after the trans community. And the first idea, the first kind of policy initiatives really around this on a broad scale were the so-called bathroom bills, first one being passed in North Carolina in 2016. And you started to see these pop up all over. And Sean, again, my coworker, was central to efforts here in Montana with allies that stopped these bathroom policies, both at the legislative and ballot committee levels. Well, those defeats started to pile up. And so no longer were bathroom bills an effective issue for them to work on. And that's when you really started to see them transition over to targeting trans athletes. So that's a little bit of how we got to trans athletes. What about the book bans? Why are those popular right now? So while the work around trans athletes is kind of a new issue area for them, book challenges have been around forever. So why are they recycling that tactic, that angle right now? Well, think about it. There was this thing called the pandemic. You're probably all familiar with it. And during that pandemic, if you think about it, in communities, there were largely conservative groups of parents that started to mobilize against school boards. And the religious right, surveying the land, said, hey, we've got people motivated. We've got people going after school boards. Let's dust off this book challenge idea. And so the book bans, these challenges to books, this again in his old tactic, but the religious right was able to look out. They saw the passion, they saw the energy, they saw the anger that was already being mobilized and existed in a community, and they saw a way to tap into it. Now, around these book bans, well, actually, I should play this clip first. So the clip that I'm going to play is a comment that a Kalispell Library Board member made in a discussion about potentially banning a book earlier this year. So let's see and get things moved around here and get this to play. And I will tell you, I've got the volume turned all the way up. Oops. And it's still pretty quiet, so I apologize.
I believe that puberty blockers are child abuse. And so when people talk about parental rights for the kids to be able to read it and the parents take care of whether the kid reads the book or not, I agree with that. But when a parent abuses a child, that child is taken away from its parent. And so puberty blockers are child abuse. Should not be allowed.
Okay, so here you have a library board member in the context of a book challenge who is saying in a public meeting that parents who are supportive of their trans kids are basically engaging in child abuse and their kids should be taken away. Now, not only is that horrifying, which is one reason to play the clip, because these are the types of comments made in public spaces all the time. But it's also, I think, a good example of how people that are part of these movements will often portray themselves as the protectors. They're the protectors of the children. They're the protectors of the community. And again, that makes sense if you think about it, because since this is part of a larger political agenda, a larger part of a larger kind of scheme and framework about mobilizing people to take action in their communities, it's a whole lot easier if you can tell people and give people talking points and a framework that allows them to portray themselves in nice, good ways. So the fact that often these are presented in terms of we're protecting kids, we're protecting the community, we're the good people, we're the saviors, makes sense, because again, that motivates people that are believers in this to engage in public spaces, and then that very easily is able to fall into and work with that larger framework. Okay, so across kind of the spectrum that we could largely call the right, from kind of these mainstream conservative examples out to hardcore white nationalists, we've seen this targeting of the community play out in recent months. We've talked a little bit about book challenges. I think that's something that Cheryl Lynn is going to talk a little bit more about, but here are some other examples. So you had the Montana Family Foundation lose their minds when a Drag Queen Story Hour was going to happen at Zoo Montana in June. So I think it's worth noting that Zoo Montana had one of their best days as far as attendance goes. And press reports, talked about how there were hundreds of people at the story hour and there were dozens of protesters outside. Similarly, during the Pride celebration or in the lead up to the Pride celebration, there were some threats and nasty comments made about a Drake Story Hour event that was happening during that. Some of those came from people that were claiming affiliation with militia groups like Oath Keepers and other extremists. Again, it's good to report that the Story Hour went off without a hitch. It was well attended, while there were a few protesters outside. And then probably the most notorious one from over the summer was when a group of 31 members of a white nationalist group called Patriot Front were on their way to the Pride celebration in the park in Coeur d'Alene, and were basically busted and arrested while they were all in a U-Haul going to protest or disrupt this event. So again, what all of that helps to show is that this targeting, this hatred directed at the community has really become a standard mobilizing issue across the right. And I think, the Patriot Front one is an interesting one to look at just because we've also seen in the last few years a more willingness of mainstream conservatives and right-wing extremists to work together in public spaces. So it used to be if Nazis showed up at a protest against Pride or a protest at a health clinic, the more mainstream groups would kind of shoo them away or would issue some sort of a public statement denouncing them. But we've seen in the last couple of years that, mainstream groups are much more likely just to kind of shrug their shoulders when some of these more extreme groups show up. And, I think part of that is what you can call the Trump effect of creating spaces for this overlap and working together to happen. And I think we need to be clear about what that means and what that brings together. You have people in these situations who are mobilized mostly in political ways, that they're there to oppose and condemn the LGBT community, now are fraternizing with people who would literally just like to wipe the community off the face of the earth if they had the chance. And so you have kind of this overlap of the political and policy wonk crowd now kind of rubbing shoulders with more of the street fighters. And I think the implications of that should be concerning to us all. And I think now with that, I want to pass it over to Sean, who's going to talk a little bit more in depth about kind of the political and legislative perspectives regarding this moment that we're in. So take it away, Sean.
Thanks, Travis. So as Travis mentioned, I am going to be talking about how we got here in terms of a national and political context. Slide. So when we think about political analysis, one thing that is always important to consider is what I like to call the pendulum effect. And basically what that is anytime you gain a lot of momentum or have a lot of wins in a particular area, naturally, politically, there is going to be a lot of pushback against those wins in that area. And if that political pushback is against something that cannot be changed or is immovable, then it will slide off into other areas. So it's important to keep that in mind when we move on to our next slide. And we're talking about some national historical context and court wins on marriage and discrimination issues. So when marriage inequality was originally framed and was really talked about by national groups, and national groups were fighting to get gay marriage recognized, one of the things that happened actually opened the door a little bit to allow for a targeting of trans community members as even there was gaining of increasing acceptance of the LGBTQ community. So specifically what I'm talking about is when marriage inequality, so to be clear, marriage inequality is absolutely discrimination. However, on the national stage, the framing for acceptance of gay marriage was framed as marriage inequality is discrimination. And it should have been framed as gay marriage is an example of discrimination that the LGBTQ community faces, or the LGBTQ community faces a lot of discrimination. One simple example of that is gay marriage, and it's something that's easy to be fixed. Unfortunately, there was so much of an emphasis on marriage as discrimination instead of discrimination including marriage, that when marriage was won, a lot of people thought that discrimination and the other issues that the LGBTQ community faced was solved. And then in addition to that, part of what we saw happening with the centering of trying to get marriage recognition was, as there was generally increasing acceptance of the LGB community, the lesbian, gay, and bisexual community, there was little mention of the trans community. And there were even a couple of national groups that actively asked trans community members not to be present or not to share their experiences. And what happened around that was there was an increase in this acceptance and visibility and knowledge around what it meant to be gay, lesbian, and bisexual, but that rise in acceptance and knowledge did not also increase when we were talking about the trans, non-binary, and two-spirit community. Slide. So what we see as a result of this is that when visibility for the trans community started to come to the forefront, and we started to see Laverne Cox on the cover of Time magazine, and people started to become more familiar with, for example, Chaz Bono and Caitlyn Jenner. There was an increase in visibility of trans people. However, when it happened without nuance, meaning there was no conversation about Black, Indigenous, and people of color's experiences around gender or how they see themselves in their community. There was no depth in coverage. In addition to this, there was very little community control. And what I mean by this is that trans people weren't telling their own stories. People who were not trans were directing how those stories were being told, which is part of the reason that the narrative that being trans means it feels like you're trapped in the wrong body exists. And without that community control, one of the big things that happened was there was a lack of centering of the trans community as humans. And first and foremost, as people existing within a community, being themselves, being equal members of the community, being engaged and paying taxes and getting involved in different areas of activism and volunteering. And that lack of human centering really created even more of a void. And then the final thing that really happened as this increase in visibility happened was that there wasn't a relational emphasis. It wasn't about building relationships with people to understand who they are. Oftentimes trans stories got told, and again, without the existence of BIPOC individuals and without the existence of non-binary and two-spirit identities. And so those stories being told weren't about people in relationship with their communities or with their families or any of this. And all of that combined to create a very large void, which the media was able to take advantage of. And we'll see a little bit more on this next slide. So I have three pretty explicit examples of how the media took advantage of trans stories and portrayed them in a way where oftentimes they didn't even acknowledge that they were talking about trans people. They used very vulgar language and completely eradicated the existence of the individual and their identity as a person to be able to create a punchline and draw attention and popularize the individual at the expense of a community in very disturbing ways. So the first is Jerry Springer, and there are a lot of examples where he brought people on their show to reveal, oh, this person is dating someone who is trans, or, oh, you've fallen in love with this person on the internet, but as it turns out, you fell in love with a trans person. And oftentimes the word trans isn't used. Oftentimes it's even more degrading language. So instead of saying trans, they'll say, did you know that this person is really, and use their biological sex characteristics as an identifier instead of their gender identity. So one of the things that we see with Jerry Springer and his effect is creating the narrative that trans people are rare, that they're bizarre, that they're less than human, and really it's almost creating this freak show effect. And another example is Adam Sandler. And if you go and watch, there's a number of different Adam Sandler movies where it's revealed that a character dresses up as something else and isn't actually what they portray themselves to be, or is a trans person. Again, they don't use the specific language that it's a trans person. They use language that creates a trans community to be at the butt of a joke. So there's this narrative that people who are attracted to trans people are gay or stupid, or they were fooled and become the butt of jokes. And really, this plays really, really deeply into homophobia and misogyny. And part of the reason that that's important is because homophobia and misogyny really fuel transphobia and are related very closely with transphobia. And so oftentimes people make such explicit transphobic jokes to separate themselves from potential accusations of being gay or, accepting women, or understanding that gender is an identity and is who people actually are. And then the last example we have is Jim Carrey. And there are many examples of this in a lot of his comedic works, especially during the early 2000s, where trans people, once again, aren't called trans people, but they are people that are hiding something and they need to be found out and exposed. And literally there is an antagonist in one of Jim Carrey's movies, and the whole plot and the whole joke at the end of the movie is that the trans person is literally exposed. And so part of the reason that it's important to understand these societal and media depictions of trans people is because all of this comes together and is fueled by the actions of the far right and feeds into the political system that exists to create opportunities to put a big target on the trans community's backs. And as much of there is a target on trans people, there's even more of a target on non-binary people, two-spirit people, and trans people that are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So let's move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about how that transphobia pours back into politics. So Travis mentioned a little bit earlier about the bathroom bills, and specifically House Bill 2, which happened in North Carolina. And one of the things that was really interesting about North Carolina is that there were a lot of different factors that played in to create a very unique moment where the response to North Carolina and their anti-trans legislation happened on a national stage. It happened very publicly. It happened very widely. And basically, there was a huge response. That type of response that was seen to North Carolina, and I'm talking about like national athletes pulling out of national athletic organizations saying that they weren't going to host championships in the state. Another example is professional musicians canceling concerts that were scheduled to happen in the state. We saw organizations like PayPal and other big businesses say that they weren't going to follow through with promises that they had made to create businesses within the state. One of the other things that was really effective about countering what happened in North Carolina was that oftentimes when these attacks happen, they're centered around trans women, right? If we think back to most of those examples on the previous slide, those jokes, especially that happened in movies, were focused on trans women. And one thing that we see is trans women are primarily attacked and used as an example. And then there's very little visibility around trans men. One of the things that was especially effective on the countering the bathroom bill in North Carolina was this big campaign where trans men started talking about, well, if you pass these bills, it will put people that look like myself in women's bathrooms, and then you really will have a man in the woman's bathroom. So one of the things that we've seen is the effectiveness of trying to counter some of that transphobia targeted at trans women with the ability to have trans masculine folks share their experiences and really counter just how ineffective many of these laws or bills are. Go ahead and pull up the next content. One thing that's really important when we think about this, though, is the effectiveness of the trans masculine narrative being able to counter the attacks on the trans feminine narrative is that as a result of that, oftentimes they have started to construct bills and other targeted attacks specifically at trans women and removing trans men from those bills. So instead of the Protect Sports Act, it's the Protect Women's Sports Act. And instead of trying to say trans people shouldn't be able to play sports, because there is such an effective counter narrative to say trans men playing in women's sports is not fair for that man or for any of the women that have to compete with him. They have switched to just cutting out those trans masculine identities altogether. So part of the reason that these attacks have switched to not just targeting trans issues, but specifically to targeting trans kids, is that a lot of the time, the countering that was the most effective was very humanizing counter narratives about trans people and who we are in the community. Again, this increasing visibility coupled with knowledge and information and relationship building makes the difference. So when you just have visibility of trans people without any sort of directive about how that information is shared from the perspective of the trans community, or being inclusive and focused on the fact that trans people are human and members of our community, it puts a target on people's backs. So to counter that, there has been a massive effort to do trans storytelling, for trans people to be able to talk about who they are and what their experiences are. And then as a result of that, that is part of why the attacks have switched to kids, because trans storytelling often works to protect kids and individuals from all of the negative feedback that happens from the media, from the far right, from politicians, and the internalized impact of having to be so out on a public stage that trans kids haven't been encouraged to share their stories in the same way for natural reasons. And it is really important to continue to be aware of that, so we are not exploiting kids for their stories in order to prevent political attacks from happening on the rest of the community. So it takes a really intentional and focused approach. But just real quick, as Travis mentioned, the COVID pandemic created an incredible opportunity to bring a bunch of far-right extremists together and bring in this narrative of removing the freedoms of some people to advance the parental rights of others. Of course, it's never framed that way. It's always framed as parental rights. Well, really, the parental rights that are happening is censorship and attacks on some specific members of the community. So, in addition to that, part of the reason that the attack started to switch on kids is because of this desire to activate parents, right? When people started to realize that trans people didn't provide as much of a threat as people were talking about with the bathroom rhetoric and the bathroom narrative, then people kind of started to say, well, I don't care what you do as long as it doesn't affect what I do. So the far right's counter to that has been to say, well, this does affect you because your kids will be playing against what they see as an unfair advantage. When the reality is there is, first of all, not an advantage in, for example, sports, but also the reality is that the true motivations, and we can see it because of the groups that are still involved and have historically been involved, are anti-LGBTQ motivations. And then another point and another reason that they started to switch the attack to kids and to sports specifically was this desire to create a wedge between the trans community and women's rights. And part of that is a banner that they like to wrap themselves in, as Travis has mentioned, to talk about how they're actually protecting people, when the reality is they're really attacking people. And the reason for that, and part of how we know that, is if they really cared about women's sports, then there are a lot of things that female athletes are asking for. They're asking for equal pay. They're asking for better facilities. They're asking for equal sponsorships. They're asking for equal airtime. There aren't professional women's athletes who have been able to identify trans people that create an inequality. That's not what women are asking for. They're asking for more coverage, for more support, and for more equality. And then once again, all of this ties back into the lack of familiarity and understanding on trans issues. Because there's less familiarity with who trans people are, it's easier to target them. So let's move on and talk about some trends that we're seeing that demonstrate that attacking trans youth is specifically and intentionally done to score political points. There was a survey done that found that in every state that introduced anti-trans legislation in the first month of the legislative session, every single swing state other than Nevada had an anti-trans bill. So if you were to take a map of all of the swing states if you were to make a map of all of the states that introduced anti-trans legislation, every single one of those were swing states. In addition to that, the other states that had those bills had a major political candidate vying for the presidency or a major Senate seat. In addition to that, linguistical analysis has demonstrated that there is a direct connection between how Republican politicians talk about trans issues and their intention for running for higher office. So the more transphobic and villainizing the language a politician uses, the more likely they are to have ambitions to run for higher office. Next slide. Other things that we're seeing that really demonstrate that this is a national thing and a national trend being driven by far-right groups and then falling into the state of Montana is the fact that most of the anti-trans bills that have been introduced in the legislative session in Montana, almost all of them are direct copies of bill drafts that are available online from national groups. So this isn't a grassroots issue. This isn't something that politicians are coming up with on their own. They're hearing all of this media and information from far-right groups. They have the basis in the trans community as a joke and being villainized and dehumanized, and then they're seeing an opportunity to really capitalize on this for their own political gain. One of the other things that we're really seeing, especially with the anti-trans sports bills, is that those are happening in states where organizations aren't able to point to a single trans athlete that is participating in sports that would be affected by the bills. Now, really what we know is that these bills will prevent trans athletes from being involved, and we know that they have a massive impact on the amount of discrimination and hardships that trans community members face. And we also know that they have a large internalized impact. But the fact that legislators cannot point to single incidences in the state of Montana of a trans person that would be affected by these bills is pretty significant. And then in addition to that, we're really seeing a rise of this return to the groomer narrative. And years ago, there was this understanding or belief, there was this lack of understanding and belief that the LGBTQ community was going after kids, right? That we're trying to make it socially acceptable for young kids to come out as gay. As it turns out, we are, because as it turns out, we know that when there's community support, when there's less discrimination, people are able to live their lives more freely, more fully, and more productively. But there is this resurgence of the groomer narrative, and part of the reason that is happening is the shift to attack the rights of trans youth. And then finally, when those talking points aren't enough, the far right and political organizations are bringing up this idea of culture wars. Everything that we grew up with and held dear as values are going out the window, and their values aren't our values. And I'll tell you what, I was raised to think that in the state of Montana, we believe in live and let live, and my rights stop at another person's nose. Well, that seems to be shifting, especially with these narratives. And it's really to push those beliefs out the window to be able to further their own political and social gains. And then real quick, one last little side note. I think I have two last slides. Is a trend that examines that a lot of this at its root, and a lot of the supporters that push these bills, it is rooted in transphobia, in homophobia, and in misogyny. So this is actually a map of transgender porn related searches based on geographical area. So the places that you see highlighted in red have the highest rates of searches of trans porn. And I have those states listed out on the left. You can see that many of the more conservative states and most of the states where these anti-trans bills are originating from are at the top of the list for consumption of trans porn. We'll go to one last slide. And this last slide just demonstrates on your left is a map of those states that have those searches on a less problematic name for transgender women. On the right, you see the searches based on more problematic words for transgender women. And you can see that the more problematic the understanding of what a trans woman is, or the language used to refer to them, is more centralized in those areas where we see higher rates of discrimination, higher rates of violence, and higher rates of introduction of anti-LGBTQ and specifically anti-trans bills. So I'm going to turn it over now to Sherilyn, who is going to talk about where we go from here and what we can all do to help counteract a lot of this.
So thanks so much, Sean. So I'm Sherilyn DeVries. I'm the staff person for Love Lives Here, and I also do communications work for the Montana Human Rights Network. I know this has been a lot of heavy stuff tonight and you've been hanging in there. My part will be somewhat brief, but I want to start with some good news. A viciously anti-transgender online extremist group called Kiwi Farms, which you may or may not have heard of, just had its website taken off the internet. Kiwi Farms sounds like an adorable, cute little group, but actually it was this hub for some of the worst trolling, doxing, swatting, threats, and plotting of violence against transgender people. They harassed a few trans people so viciously that they died by suicide rather than endure this constant barrage of hate. They went after one Twitch streamer really hard, and she fought back. And so this all turned over the weekend, everyone. Like, it was one of those deals where she was posting that there are people staking out different places. She was in hiding, but they were doxing her and staking her out and things like that, and planning to do physical harm or violence to her. And in just a few days, basically the threats got so horrible and the police internationally got involved that suddenly Kiwi Farms was deplatformed. And even though they were bouncing around to different providers like in Russia and China and some other places, they can't find anyone to host them anymore, and they are gone. Even their archives have been taken down. And so now Kiwi Farms is in the same place as the Daily Stormer, the neo-Nazi site that went after the Jewish community in Whitefish in 2016 and 2017. So this is some really good news that people did not know was possible, but because of enough pressure from enough angles, it happened. Anti-LGBTQ groups are terrifying because even in these times of division and hostility, we really don't expect this level of cruelty toward people in our city, in our county, in our state, and in our nation. And I'm going to tell you that our institutions and definitely trans people deserve to be protected. And so we need to move through the shock of these attacks and find ways that we can help our community to pull together to make sure that LGBTQ people, library staff, schools, and other good community members don't feel like they're alone. So yeah, sorry, I should have given you another content warning before I talked about some of the attacks that Kiwi Farms launched, but here's what we have going on ahead. Go ahead, Travis. So before we get into some very practical tips on what you can do, I have to talk about overall strategies, because one mistake that we see a lot of times in communities and with media companies is that they cover events in a way that gives these groups free advertising. And so, for instance, like when we had the situation down at Zoo Montana, so they had a Pride event, they had a drag story hour, and media companies there, they got a hold of it, and I'm sure some people in the community sent messages to the media company saying, oh my gosh, we saw that this person who has militia connections is organizing a protest against the drag queen story hour. You've got to say something. The problem is that when those stories drop ahead of the event, it ends up generating more anti-LGBTQ sentiment. It normalizes it, and it ends up causing more harm. And so it's really important that these stories are covered adequately. The other clip that you see up there is resignations from the library up here in Flathead Valley, the Imagine-If Library. Some books were dropped into the library Dropbox returns and had bullet holes in them. And if those stories are not covered well, and there's not community support around them, it ends up increasing fear in the community. And sure enough, right now at the library, we have a few resignations happening on staff because they were so intimidated by these incidents. I want to say that we take, go ahead and next slide, Travis. I want to say that we have to be very careful about how we talk about these sort of incidents. So when you see incidents of discrimination and so on, it's very important that instead of blasting a picture out on social media, which we typically see when there's anti-Semitic or racist or other kinds of anti-immigrant flyers, is people put up on social media and say, oh my gosh, look what's happening in our community. That just ends up increasing fear for people who face discrimination. And so instead of doing that, please send a photo to MHRN. Instead, we have a hate incident report form where you can send a lot of information. You can do it anonymously, or you can tell us who you are. And instead of blasting it all over social media, check in with your neighbors instead and find out if they're okay. And prime excellent example of this was in Great Falls when a lit drop happened. A mom went to go drop her kids off to school, and when she came back, there was something in her driveway, and she found out it was racist literature. And so instead of blasting it on social media, she went around to her whole neighborhood and picked all of these up, because she's like, I don't want anybody else to find it either. And so that's a good way of handling that. Go ahead, Travis. Now, we take every single incident of a dropped flyer or a White Lives Matter sticker or a threat against someone extremely seriously. At the same time, we all need to remember that the reason we tell you not to give these groups free advertising is because, just like in this cartoon here, by and large, these groups are very small. For instance, the White Lives Matter group that's putting up stickers in different towns in Montana, it's a handful of people. There are several in the group, but there's a very small number who are active. Again, we take this extremely seriously. We do not underestimate these people. At the same time, we do not want to make them seem larger than they are. Go ahead, next slide, Travis. Sorry, go one more. I want to see what the next slide is a minute, sorry. Okay, we can back up to the previous one, thank you. It's really important to break the bystander effect. When negative things happen, it's hard to know what to do, but that is exactly why MHRN is here, is because we have seen multiple variations of different incidents where extremist groups are trying to bully or intimidate or isolate different groups who face discrimination. And so we have toolkits, we have suggestions, we can offer you support in a number of ways when this kind of thing happens. But the first thing we need to do is break the bystander effect, which means going from, oh my gosh, this is terrible, I have no idea what to do, to, let's pull some people together and let's come up with a plan. Next slide, please. So some of the most important things that you can do in your community right now is attend local meetings. So tonight, what's happening in Livingston, Montana, is that a teacher in the Livingston Public Schools last school year did a very short, quick presentation about the history of LGBTQ people in the US. Like, it was very simple, but just to acknowledge that LGBTQ people are in America, and LGBTQ history is part of American history. And a group of parents got together to try to get her fired. And tonight, a lot of great people in Livingston are showing up to the school board meeting in support of that teacher, and to push back against this narrative that anyone who talks about LGBTQ issues should be removed from public schools. I would say another great thing is talk to people who are on the boards of your health board, your school board, your library board. If you have relationships with them, please have conversations with them and let them know how you feel. Sometimes these people are doing really difficult work without a whole lot of input from the community. We just kind of expect these people to work hard without much input or much engagement with folks. Please make sure that you are talking to them and letting them know. And then there's fun things you can do. Host a honk and wave. For instance, when the Flathead County Commissioners appointed pro-censorship people to the trustees to the library board, and when we were in the middle of a book challenge, so this book, the book was being challenged was on an LGBTQ issue. We had a honk and wave. It brought people in from all over. We held signs to show how much we appreciated the library and the library staff. And it was just a fun time for people to be together. And so think of fun, positive things that you can do in order to bring people together, get conversations going, and remind everyone that there are so many people who care about LGBTQ issues and trans people. Next slide, please. And one thing that I love doing is working around the power structure. Of course, elections matter, and conversations matter, and board appointments matter, and so on. But there are also great ways to work around the power structure. When the Flathead County Commissioners appointed a pro-censorship person to the library board, there wasn't much we could do about that. We couldn't get this person recalled. We couldn't recall the county commissioners, nothing like that. So what do you do when you're stuck, when someone, controls the system? And so what Love Lives Here did is we came up with, first of all, we talked to the people most impacted. That's very important when you're coming up with your plan. And so we talked to the library staff, and we said, what would you like to do in this situation? They were under pressure and they are serving all members of the community. And so what did they think would keep them safe and be effective? And they said, ask us for book recommendations, give us positive feedback, and check out queer books. And so we came up with this. There is nothing that the county commissioners and the library trustees could do to stop anyone from checking out these books, or from talking to library staff, or from giving positive feedback. And it was really wonderful to see folks come in and do this. A local church brought in baked goods for their library staff and coffee cards, coffee gift cards and stuff. It was really wonderful. And so there are a lot of different creative things that you can do. Next slide, please. Montana Human Rights Network was part of, made a lot of contributions to this, this publication by the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. And this guide, community guide for opposing hate, goes far more into depth than this presentation could. It handles so many different things, different topics. Go ahead, Travis. So there's so many components to having a positive response and helping to build a strong and connected community. And so it covers everything like dealing with conspiracy theories, communicating your message clearly, making connections to local officials, working with different institutions, social media, and security. And so it really is a real treasure of lots of different items. Next slide. So again, we are here, Montana Human Rights Network is here as a resource for you. Please report discrimination to us using our online form. You can go to mhrn.org and you can click, you can scroll down and click on report incident. And like I said, you can put as much or as little information as there is possible. And if you have direct questions, you can reach out to us. A good email for that is research@mhrn.org, and that'll go to me and Travis, and we'll be able to respond to you. Next slide. So if we're wrapping up here, but just a couple things before we go to questions. If you are interested in getting more information regarding webinars and action items and so on, please sign up for our email updates. We're in the middle of kind of shifting websites and so on, but if you email network@mhrn.org, we can get you on the list. Go ahead, Travis. We have a couple of different action items going on to protect trans health and trans youth in public schools. And so if you're on this webinar, we will send you an email with all of the links so you don't have to remember all of that. And so we are so excited to announce that our next webinar is November 16, and it's called "The Call is Coming from Inside the House: Extremism and the 2023 Montana Legislature." I think we all know that instead of us fighting off outside pressure from the outside to trying to change Montana, we have seen some legislators radicalized by national groups pushing anti-LGBTQ and other propaganda, quite frankly. And so we're having to deal with our own legislators to prevent this. And you all are our best tools to do that, because you can talk to your legislators and tell them how you feel about things.